Evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hillsborough Township Planning Board meeting of July 6, 2023. Please join me in a salute to the flag.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be advised this meeting has been duly advertised according to Section 5 of the Open Publics Meeting Act, Chapter 231, Public Law 1975, otherwise known as the Sunshine Law. Notice of the 2023 annual meeting schedule and amended meeting dates have been provided to the officially designated newspapers, the Township Clerk, posted on the Township's website, and available here at the Hillsborough Township Municipal Complex. In addition, application documents have been made available on the Township Civic Clerk website, and complete application files are available in the Planning and Zoning Department for inspection in accordance with the public meeting notice. With that, may I have a roll call of Planning Board members and also Board and Township professionals, please?
Vice Chair Julian, Mr. Delcor, Mr. Radowitz, and Mr. Hestag are absent. Mr. Wagner?
Here.
Mr. Peason?
Here.
Mr. Scobo?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Committeeman Ciccarelli?
Here.
Mayor Lapani?
Here.
Chair Sirachi?
Here.
Mr. Coyce?
Here.
Mr. Bernstein?
Here.
Mr. Mayhew?
Here.
And myself and the videographer are here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we do not have consideration of meeting minutes nor resolutions. However, we do have a couple of planning board business items. One will explain Mr. Hashtag's absence, that he has resigned from his seat number 9. Do we need to formally accept?
No.
Okay. And with that, since he held the position of secretary, we need to elect a new board secretary that was previously held by Mr. Hashtag. But before we go there, I just want to formally just thank Ken Hashtag for all the years that he served here. I know I served with him a long time, and he is going to be missed with all that experience. But yeah, fortunately, sometimes life gets in the way, particularly the full-time jobs. But he will be missed. So just thank you again, Ken, for your years of service. So with that, I am going to open up the floor for nominations for board secretary.
Mr. Chairman, first I'd like to reiterate your words about Mr. Hashtag and his terms of service on the planning board. Obviously, as a formal chair years ago, he was on it then too. So and I think he's been the pen for years. So we'll miss him and his sound judgment with everything that goes on town. But I would like to nominate Mr. Rob Peason to be the replacement secretary.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Oh, look at that man jumping in. Give me a chance.
You're right on it.
Okay.
You had your coffee this morning.
Yeah.
That's right.
Are there any other nominations? Okay, hearing none, I will close nominations, and we'll ask for a roll call to elect Mr. Peason as the board secretary for the remainder of the 2023 year.
Mr. Wagner?
Yes.
Mr. Peason?
I'll abstain for myself.
Mr. Scobo?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Committeeman Ciccarelli?
Yes.
Mayor Lapani?
Yes, and here's the pen.
Chair Sirachi?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Peason.
Okay. With that, we do not have consideration of ordinances, so we will go to business from the floor for matters not on this evening's agenda. And as I've stated previously, please refrain from any comments involving warehouses in general. We would like to get those on the record since we have many applications, considering the one for tonight, but also I think for the rest of the calendar year. So it will be important to get those comments on the record. If there's any, please come up to the mic and state your name and address for the record. And we do have a 5-minute time limit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Brooks, 7 Winding Way. Last evening, I had the honor of attending another planning board meeting with the ever-present attorney, Mr. Bernstein, residing.
You were better dressed last night, too.
a large crowd had gathered to watch the proceedings, which incidentally related to an application for a large warehouse. But that's not why I'm here.
Mike's not on.
You just have to
You're
speak
right.
directly into it.
It's on. Okay.
It's on.
No.
Or you just, you have to talk right into it. Right. Yep.
I'm here to request.
Okay, you're right. Take this one.
Okay.
I thought we would try this.
I would say I'm here to request a new microphone system,
Join the club.
but that's not why I'm here either. I'm here because I noticed how Franklin Township treats its public speakers. Franklin provides a podium, an actual fixed podium with a place that you can put your papers. And I would say to you, it provides a more inviting, encouraging atmosphere for the public to be able to speak and not, again, be somewhat intimidated for those who are a little bit concerned about getting up here. I'm here because I would like to repeat a request that I have made to this board and actually to the township itself, that somebody provides a podium for the public so that when people have papers, they can put them down like this. And I think that the planning board is a perfect opportunity for us to allow for encouraging the public to speak. I think that's what we really want, right? Part of any democratic process is encouraging people to get up and speak and present information that may, in fact, ultimately change your minds with regards to whether an application is appropriate or not for approval. Again, I'm not here to talk about that, but I just would say I think it's time that we act, this board, act in some formal fashion to encourage, not discourage, public participation by setting up some formal means of having a place to put our papers. Last meeting, when I attempted to have a more relaxed environment over there, I was told you can't sit there. And so that again discourages people who might bring papers in order to present a more coherent presentation to all of you. And that's one of the reasons why I would again make that request. I have in the past, but I would just repeat it again. And I appreciate you considering that, potentially passing a resolution or asking somebody in staff to do something that could help the public be more comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just for the entire picture of last night, first of all, there is a reason why there is a podium at the Franklin Township Planning Board meeting. The board meeting for this application is being held in the administration building of the Board of Ed, not the Township Municipal Building. The only table that existed other than for the board, which was literally sitting around standing tables, was for the applicant and his witnesses. Everybody else was put into the corner, literally over here, to speak from a podium that the Board of Ed provided so that everyone could speak, not only Mr. Brook, who came up for actually an item unrelated to the application last night also, but also for the objector, the objector's witnesses, and the public, the handful who did come up. They had a much larger crowd last night, I will tell you, than tonight. So just for the context of why there is a podium there is a podium there because that's the only place anyone's being allowed to stand unless you're either presenting your application or you're on the board. So,
Okay.
at least for this application. They may be doing it slightly differently in the municipal building, but for the purposes of the application that Mr. Brook attended last night, that's the reason.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that reinforces everything I just said. Thank you, Mr. Bernstein.
Okay, anyone else before we go to this evening's hearing? Okay, see no one. We're moving on to this evening's application, Weston Road LLC, with file number 22-PB-03-MSPV, with time of decision July 31st of this year, and this application is being continued from the June 8th meeting without further notice. And so I don't need to invite the applicant and the objectors up. They've already, but it looks like they may have switched sides. I don't know. Okay. No, they sit that way.
Good evening, members of the board. As you know, my name is Mike Ogrodnik with Savo Shock Law Firm in Somerville on behalf of Weston Road LLC. We're here on our 8th hearing, public hearing on this application. I believe that we left off with a cross-examination of Tom Offenard, who's been qualified as our professional environmental consultant, and I would just ask that we reaffirm his swearing in and continue with the cross-examination from the Objectors' Counsel.
Okay, I'm just going to take it, no changes in the status of your credentials, suspensions, or anything since
No
last time you were
changes.
here? Okay, thank you, and I guess we will re-swear him in.
Swear any testimony you give tonight is going to be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
I do.
And for the record, please state your name, please.
Tom Offenord, Auffenorde.
Okay, thank you. Counselors?
For the record, Jordan Nash with the law firm Riker Danzig, representing the Hearthstone Homeowners Association, along with my co-counsel Michael Sinkovich, Learman, Blecker, and Sinkovich. My recollection of where we left off was that I had just finished and that he was going to be open for the public questioning. So I apologize if I said differently, but I don't have any further questions for this witness.
That's fine. Giving you another chance at the bite at the apple. So, all right. So with that, then, may I have a motion to open to public?
So moved. Second?
All in favor? Aye. Okay. If there is anyone from the public that would like to question the witness on his testimony from our last meeting, please feel free to come up to the mic, and we may have to share one of the mics, and state your name and address for the record. Okay. What? Yeah. No one needs to kind of hesitate. This is.
Good evening, everyone. Mayor Richard Onderko, 325 North Main Street, Manville, New Jersey. I wish I had a podium to set my leather valise on, but in Manville, our podium floated away, so we're looking for a new one. So, sir, you testified that all the species that were on this property were not impacted adversely, correct? The blue herring and whatever else you mentioned.
Yes, I believe that was my testimony.
You forgot
the
to-
wildlife on the site is common to a suburban area, and in our report, obviously during construction, wildlife is going to be displaced in the disturbance area. Following construction, the species that are adapted to the remaining habitats and areas around the building, et cetera, will continue to use the site.
You forgot the most important species, though, the human species. We're going to be adversely impacted by this project. And I represent 11,000 people in Manville. We flood severely.
All right, Mayor, please, questions?
Questions?
Yeah.
Will this project adversely impact flooding, or does it improve the runoff situation?
It's an engineering question. It's already been.
Do you
we've had
think this
several nights in
project
here.
adversely impacts our environment?
I think the impacts have been mitigated to the extent that they can be, given the zoning, et cetera.
Where does all the stormwater runoff go?
Again, I have to note my objection for the record. Mr. Offenord is our environmental consultant, not the civil engineer, and we've
should
spent.
know about the environment.
I'm not done. So we've spent about 3 nights talking about stormwater management with Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford's not here this evening because his testimony is not necessary until rebuttal, and I would just ask that any questions for Mr. Offenord be focused on the scope of his direct examination, which is the environmental impact and the EIS that he had prepared.
Well, I think it's important to note that the environment will be adversely impacted by this project, and it will be a detriment to the Manville
Mr. Mayor.
residents.
Questions only.
I'll be back under the public comment.
Okay, thank you.
Maria Janusik, 720 East Freck Avenue, Manville, New Jersey. I'm also a Hillsborough Township property owner, Block 86, Lot 3, 2155 Camp Plain Road. On this property, are there any flood hazard areas?
No, there's not a regulated flood hazard area.
Is there any area that's under the control of the Delaware and Raritan Canal Commission?
Yes, there are.
Has there been any application submitted to the Delaware and Raritan Canal Commission in regard to what's going on this property?
Yes.
Has there been a response?
There's been a comment letter from the DRCC, the Canal Commission.
Okay, and what is their comment?
Ms. Janusik, it's on the website portal. Mr.
Okay,
Ford
can we
addresses.
have a brief, since there are a lot of people here, can we have a brief explanation or statement on what the DNR Canal Commission has stated in regard to this application?
I'm really not familiar with those details. They're stormwater oriented and the engineers addressing those.
They're only stormwater oriented and nothing to do with other environmental things going on that property?
Ms. Janusik, Mr. Ford went through his testimony related to stormwater. It's the wrong professional.
I'm not asking about stormwater. Mr. Offenord mentioned stormwater. I'm asking what was provided in regard to this application.
I'm going to direct the
from
witness not to
Delaware
answer
and
any
Raritan
questions
Canal
related to
Commission.
DRCC review memorandums because they speak for themselves. So you can read them on Civic Clerk, and you can ask Mr. Ford about them when he returns for his rebuttal testimony.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Though I know others are enjoying this more than others, if Mr. Offenord cannot answer the question because he is not familiar with or capable of answering for whatever reason, let him answer it that way. The answer to the question for the board, because it's the board who's hearing the application, is not, it's on Civic Clerk. The member of the public can go look at Civic Clerk. He needs to answer the questions if he can't. If he can't, he can't.
Okay. As far as I'm concerned, I haven't been asked to address anything from the DRCC. So to me, that means there's no environmental issues.
So you have no contact with the Delaware and Raritan Canal Commission?
I do not.
Okay. Are there freshwater wetlands on this property?
Yes, there are.
What is the importance of freshwater wetlands?
They serve as wildlife habitat. If they're in floodplains, they can be involved in flood storage, and also natural attenuation or treatment, basically, of waters, runoff waters.
So they're very important in treating runoff water that would be going into where the Royce Brook?
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately. So if you don't have that water going through something that filters and cleans it, you're going to get a lot of debris and other possible contaminants going into the Royce Brook.
Well, we have a stormwater detention basin that actually is designed to treat the stormwater.
The basin, but other water can still be going through that normally would be filtered.
Yeah, they can and will.
So freshwater wetlands are very important.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So important that New Jersey has a Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So how many permits are required for this application?
2 permits.
Only 2?
Yeah. a permit for road crossing of wetlands, general permit, and a transition area or buffer averaging plan, which is a process whereby you reduce the wetland buffer in one part of the site, and then you increase it in another part of the site. I believe I testified to that at the last hearing.
So you take away a buffer from one area that is a natural buffer, and you're going to create an artificial buffer somewhere else?
No.
No?
The buffer that's increased is undisturbed natural land.
But you're
You don't
saying-
have to create it, it's just increasing the size of the buffer in another part of the wetland.
And what do you mean by increasing it? What do you do?
Well, you might reduce it from 50 feet down to 30 feet, and then in another part of the site, you increase it from 50 feet to 70 feet.
Okay, but what does that mean? How are you increasing it?
You prepare a map that shows the larger wetland buffer, and that gets reviewed by the NJDEP. If they approve it, a condition of that approval is that you have to deed restrict that compensation area, that increased buffer. You have to protect it from any disturbance in the future, in perpetuity, essentially. And that gets recorded on the deed, and that's a standard condition of a transition area averaging plan.
So when you decrease the buffer area in one place, you're displacing species that have habitats there?
Yes, but you're providing compensation by increasing on another part of the wetland.
Do the species know that they're supposed to move to the other side?
Well, the reduction usually is for some sort of activity, and the compensation, again, is, to provide a give back for that. But the species, it's going to be, the area that's reduced is going to have some sort of development activity on it. So it may or may not be suitable for the species. The species will go where they're going to go, wherever it's appropriate.
Right, but like in Manville, we have a lot of deer.
Okay,
that we
question,
haven't had in a long
please.
time. So when you displace them, do they have somewhere to go? Because, you're saying you have a little bit of extra on the other side or wherever it's going to be. But how does that impact all of these? So, all right, so are there any endangered species?
No.
No. Are there any federal?
There is, the site has been identified as, the activity, the project, the project had the potential. So we went to Fish and Wildlife and we did the screening review. And they identified
I'm sorry, who'd you go to?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
U.S. Department of Fish?
Yes.
U.S. Department of Fish
Yeah,
and Wildlife?
they're responsible for regulation of federally listed species. That screening review indicated that the project could potentially affect Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat. And this is very common for any project in northern New Jersey. Because we need these wetland permits, when the wetland permit is submitted to the NJDEP, they provide a copy of the permit application to review to Fish and Wildlife Service for their review. And typically, and what we expect in this case, is to protect Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat, they're going to require and these are species that use trees. So we expect that Fish and Wildlife will require a timing restriction for tree clearing. In other words, you would not be able to clear trees for this project during the time of year that bats are active, April through October. So you could only do the tree clearing in the winter. So that's how the bats will be protected.
Okay.
And that's their standard sort of recommendation.
But you're going to clear, how many trees, do you know how many trees are going to be cleared?
I don't know exactly, no.
Okay. So these bats, if the trees are cleared, where are they going to go when it's time for them to come back?
They'll find other places.
Okay. The building that's going to be put on this property is the size of, I think someone had said, 3 football.
Can't hear you.
The building, is it working?
No.
Get the other one. We got this.
The building that's going to be on the property is about 3 times the size of a football field, from what I understand. This building is going to have a metal roof. In the summer, that's got to radiate a lot of heat. How does that impact the environment as far as birds or even animals that would be, jumping on a roof or whatever? How does that impact that environment?
Well, the building size is, determined by the zoning.
Share a mic.
Oh, got it? Okay, yeah. The building size is a function of zoning. Yeah, it's going to have a flat roof. Actually, per regulation, 40% of the roof has to be designed to accept solar generation for electricity. I don't know that they're going to initially start with that and put that on the site, but that's a very positive environmental attribute of the roof that could be taken advantage of.
Why is that positive environmental?
Because you're not burning fossil fuels to generate your electricity.
Okay, but in that specific area, how is that a positive?
Because you're not burning fossil fuels for electricity.
Okay,
Some
so
portion of your electricity.
40% of the roof would be for solar, and the rest of it is just a very, in the summertime, super hot metal roof that radiates heat. Does that have an impact on birds, or if like squirrels were, to get on it or whatever? What kind of impact does it have in that environment, being that it is a wooded wetland area?
It could be a hot roof, but I'm reading that more and more these roofs are actually being coated or painted white, so you get maximum reflection of solar radiation to keep the building cooler, keep your air conditioning costs down, but it also keeps the roof a little.
Okay, but right now the solar is not being installed. Right now, it's not being installed. I don't know if that's.
I don't know.
Yeah, as far as I understand, it's not being installed. So right now, all we have is a 3 football field size hot metal roof in this environment that has freshwater wetlands and seems to be a very environmentally important area. Thank you.
Trying to give the mic back.
Thank you. Hi, Elaine Welsh, Orchard Drive, Hillsborough. I think when we left off at the last meeting, there was a question of something I wasn't familiar with. I was hoping you could clarify it for me. The notes that I wrote, it says there's an environmental impact statement and it should address social inputs. Can you explain what that is and how it was done?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, like I say, I'm not familiar with it either, and I wrote my notes from our last meeting, and I wrote that there should be an environmental input statement, and that it was supposed to address social impacts. So that's not, I got that out of thin air, I guess. Like I say, I'm not familiar. I just am reading my notes from the last meeting.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So no clue. I'm probably clueless too. Thank you.
Sorry.
Steal this.
Sure.
David Brook, 7 Winding Way. Can you just pronounce your name again, please?
Yeah. Offenord.
Do you have a first name?
Tom.
Tom, is that okay?
That's fine.
Thank you. I'm not good at
David?
pronunciations. Yep. You mentioned doing is it classified as an environmental assessment? Is that the right term for it?
Environmental impact statement.
Environmental impact statement. Can you just explain, I know you talked about the report. What was your role in preparing this report?
I oversaw the writing of it, provided final review, very familiar with the site. I've been on the site numerous times over the years. So, I'm very familiar with the Hillsborough process and EIS ordinance. So that was my role.
Okay. I think when you were talking and providing testimony before, you mentioned about the adjacent landfill to the property. Does any of that landfill touch this proposed property in any way from the point of view of, does any of it overlap onto this property?
I really can't speak to that.
Okay. You also mentioned about groundwater. There's groundwater under the property, correct? Are you familiar with, or did your study examine potable wells that are used for drinking water purposes in that adjacent area?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But I believe we reviewed the mapping of wellhead protection areas, and there's not a wellhead protection area on this site.
I'm vaguely familiar with wellhead protection areas, but I guess my question was, there are potable wells within that area. There is not a water line that covers all of the older properties there. Do you know, when you did your study, did you identify any of those adjacent wells?
No.
Okay. And when you did the study, did you look at any, you mentioned groundwater under the property and potential impacts from development. When you did the study, did you take any samples of groundwater at the property?
No. No, that's not required by ordinance at all.
Okay. Did you take any soil samples of the property, recognizing the adjacent landfill?
No, that wasn't, you mean for like contamination issues?
Correct.
Yeah, no.
Not the scope of the assessment?
No.
Okay. You mentioned you've been on the site a number of times. You've actually walked the site?
Yes.
Okay. So you were able to confirm the conditions identified in the mapping as being accurate?
Yes.
Okay. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Tarantino, Fairfield Lane. Did your report address air quality issues?
It did, yeah. I testified to that at the last hearing.
Okay. And did you take any air samples, ambient air samples?
No, we did not.
Okay. Did you do any modeling of emissions, or
No.
Did you take into consideration air emissions from the building, like from the HVAC system?
No.
And why not?
That's not required by ordinance for an EIS.
Okay. Would emissions from like a fuel burning source to heat the building contribute to air emissions on the site?
I guess.
You guess? In what way wouldn't it?
Yeah, you're burning a fuel, so, but the primary, that primary air quality issue is vehicle emissions.
Okay. Let's just stay on the fuel burning for a second. So what fuel will they be burning for this building?
I don't know.
Okay. So you did an air quality assessment, but you didn't look into what kind of fuel they're going to be burning?
It focuses on the air quality sampling that that's done by New Jersey DEP, across the whole state.
So
That's what my assessment focused
So
on.
the DEP did sampling on the site?
No, they have,
The DEP did sampling near the site?
no,
The DEP did sampling in Hillsborough?
no.
Okay. So they did some kind of sampling, but you're saying it's relevant to the site?
Yeah.
Okay. In what way is it relevant?
The point I made is that DEP samples air quality all over the state, and there are a number of things that they sample for, and all of those things, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, all of those, and particulates, all of those pollutants are within the standard across the entire state of New Jersey, including in very dense areas like Leonia, near major highways, and a lot of development. The one pollutant that New Jersey and regionally has exceedances of the standards is ozone. And those exceedances are a couple of days a year, typically in the summer when it's hot and humid. And New Jersey is actually getting pretty close to meeting that standard. It's been decreasing
Right.
erratically over the last 10
But
years.
in
or
what
so.
way is this assessment related to the warehouse?
Well, that New Jersey does not really have an air quality problem except for ozone, and the areas where ozone is a problem are areas like Leonia or New Brunswick, the Route 18 area. They sample for ozone in Flemington, which is a similar town to Hillsborough to some degree, and there's no exceedances of the ozone standard in Flemington. So from that, I infer that there's not going to be an issue in Hillsborough from this development.
Okay, so you didn't sample,
No.
and you didn't estimate the emissions.
No.
Okay. How about
There was a air quality report conducted by another consultant that did address those things, and again, it's on the website.
for this site?
Yeah.
Okay.
He estimated emissions and things like that.
And you took those emissions
No.
into account in your assessment? You didn't?
No, he did a separate assessment.
Okay, but
My
in your
assessment was more general.
didn't take that into consideration?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I referenced it.
Did you take into consideration any other emission sources, like maybe there was the potential company that was going to lease it talked about having a truck that would move trailers around on this that would be dedicated to the site? Did you take into consideration any of those such emissions?
No.
And how about from mobile sources? How about from trucks? Diesel sources?
No.
Okay.
Because I don't think there's going to be a problem.
On what basis? On what basis are you making that?
The standards are not exceeded.
So you're just
in areas that are similar to Hillsborough in terms of population density and highways and things like that.
So just based on, in what way is Hillsborough similar to Flemington? Is your report address that?
Well, it's more similar than New Brunswick area.
Does your report address that? Does your report establish that Hillsborough is similar to Flemington, and therefore you can make this inference about Hillsborough because of Flemington?
I believe so. Yeah.
You have that in the report?
I think so, but I'm not positive.
What page of the report? Because I did not see it.
Well, maybe I didn't make that case, but
Okay.
I'm making it in testimony.
Okay, you're going to revise your report?
No, we're not going to revise any reports.
Okay.
So that's how I addressed air quality in my report.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, don't see anyone else, so.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, a member from the public raised one of the questions about the potential social impact, and I would just like to bring to the board's attention and to the professional providing testimony. So in the EIS report, section, chapter 160, in G, it says the following: alternatives to the proposed project including that of, number one, that of no project. Number two, description of alternatives with an objective evaluation of the alternatives that might avoid some or all of the adverse environmental effects with the rationale for acceptability or non-acceptability of each alternative. And number three, an analysis of the cost and social impact of the alternatives. I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention that that word is in the EIS requirements.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman,
Questions from the board?
before Mr. Offenord departs, I would like to point out to the board and public that the air quality report he referred to, yes, has been provided to this board, but since it has not been testified to, and if it is not testified to, it will not become part of the determination record for the purpose of the board. So.
Thank you. All right. Any board members, professionals? Any thoughts? Okay. Thank you. Any additional?
Our next witness is Keenan Hughes, our professional planner.
Good evening.
You swear any testimony you give tonight is going to be the truth, the whole truth, about the truth?
I do.
State, spell your name, please.
It's Keenan Hughes, Hughes.
Mr. Hughes, could you provide your qualifications to the board that qualifies you as an expert in the area of professional planning?
Sure. I'm a licensed professional planner in the state of New Jersey. I'm a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. I'm a principal of Phillips Price, which is a planning firm based in Hoboken. I represent a number of municipalities in New Jersey on planning and zoning matters, and also advise private clients as well, and frequently appear as an expert witness before planning and zoning boards throughout the state.
Okay. Is there any objections? Okay. Hearing none, we accept.
Thank you.
Let's continue.
All right, so as the planner on this particular project, my scope of work was to evaluate this application before the planning board from a planning perspective, with a particular focus on the relief that's being requested from the planning board. So as part of my work, I visited the site and the surrounding area. I reviewed the application and all the supporting materials. I either attended or reviewed transcripts of prior hearings on this matter, and of course reviewed correspondence from the board's professionals as well. I know the board has obviously heard quite a bit of testimony on this application to date, so I'm not going to repeat much of what you heard in terms of describing the site itself. I would just note from a planning perspective, some of the key characteristics of the site is its size at 18 acres, the shape of the property, which I would describe as irregular, and its current state as undeveloped and wooded with some wetland areas. The surrounding land use context here is to the north, the Hearthstone Hillsborough age-restricted residential community. To the east is generally an adjoining industrial use, the rail tracks, the airport farther to the southeast. We also have single-family dwellings to the northwest and the closed landfill to the southwest of the site. In terms of the proposed development, and again, I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail here, but I would just emphasize a couple of things from a planning viewpoint that are notable about the proposed site layout. One is the orientation of the building. So you'll note that the loading facilities have been oriented away from the residential uses across Weston Road. Those loading facilities are located adjacent to an existing industrial use, and the narrow width or the narrowmost facade of the building is also facing the frontage along Weston Road. Likewise, parking and circulation areas have, for the most part, been oriented away from the frontage of the site and substantially separated from the residential uses across the street. From a coverage standpoint, you'll note that the permitted coverage in this I-1 zone is 60%. This proposed development is at roughly 40%, and a significant setback to the front property line is also being provided the proposed building. So this property is located within the I-1 light industrial zone, which permits a number of non-residential uses, including offices and office buildings, warehousing, shipping, and receiving completely within an enclosed building, assembly, finished products completely within an enclosed building, research, lumber yards, freestanding restaurants, and restaurants located in multi-use buildings, not including drive-through facilities, childcare and adult daycare centers, contractor facilities, indoor recreation facilities, medical offices, and veterinary hospitals, retail sales of goods and services limited to products manufactured by that company with restrictions, and fiduciary institutions. So a variety of non-residential uses, including warehousing. So this proposed use is permitted within the I-1 zone. This is long-standing zoning of this particular property. I think it's also important to put the zoning of the property into the master plan context of Hillsborough Township, because Hillsborough is a very active community in its planning. The original master plan was adopted back in 1965. If you look at just since 1999, there have been 7 amendments to the land use element of the Hillsborough Township Master Plan. So in my experience, that's a very active community. A number of those amendments are very specific to particular zones within the township, and much of it actually focuses on economic development issues. There's also been 4 reexamination reports since that time, and I would just note for the board, not in any of those documents was there any mention or policy recommendations relative to this property or this particular I-1 zone. So not only is the zoning well established, but from a planning standpoint, the master plan treatment of the site has been consistent for decades in supporting industrial use, including warehouse facilities on this particular property. So the relief that we're seeking in the context of this application is quite minimal. There's one variance. It's for building height. The maximum building height that's permitted in this zone is 35 feet. There's a portion of this building that's to 38.4 feet. So we're requesting a C variance from the planning board. Then there's several design waivers as well, which I'll touch on in the course of my testimony. As for the C variance for building height, this is a variance that can be justified on a C2 basis, in that granting this variance to facilitate this overall project will advance certain purposes of the municipal land use law to the benefit of the overall community, and that those benefits substantially outweigh any potential detriments. So as it relates to the building height variance, what's important to note is, first of all, this is very much a function of how building height is calculated in Hillsborough Township. The building is actually 35 feet from the finished first floor. It is just the depressed grade which exists along the elevation of the building to accommodate the loading docks, where when that's factored into the overall calculation, kicks the overall building height above 35 feet, results in the proposed 38.4 feet. As I mentioned before, those loading docks are oriented to the industrial use to the east of this particular property. The building, as seen from Weston Road, is a conforming height. It will be roughly 34.4 feet as viewed from Weston Road. So that's less than what is permitted in terms of maximum building height in this particular zone. I know the board has heard some testimony relative to the operations of this site and also what has been observed in terms of the overall industry from a warehouse and distribution perspective. And the testimony that the board heard was that clear ceiling heights of roughly 36 to 40 feet are very much desired as an industry standard for warehouse distribution facilities. With this particular building, because of the building height restrictions, the clear height is going to be in the range of 27 to 30 feet, so it's less than ideal already. But the proposed height does provide the end user with efficiencies in terms of product storage internal to the facility, and as you heard, also provides the necessary clearances for storage purposes and will help minimize the overall building footprint, simply put, allowing the building to be slightly exceeding the ordinance, in my view, is a better alternative than actually expanding the building footprint to accommodate that same square footage. And I think that testimony relative to the importance of the internal clear ceiling heights, you heard from an industry expert who's very knowledgeable of not just this particular end user, but e-commerce warehouse distribution in general. In terms of benefits, and this is really interrelated to the overall proposal, developing this site with a permitted warehouse use. If the board were to grant the variance for the building height that's being requested, I think there's several purposes of the municipal land use law that would be advanced. The first would be purpose A, which is to accommodate a modern warehouse development on industrial zone land, including substantial stormwater management, which currently doesn't exist, as well as the protection and compensation of wetlands areas. All of that will advance the general welfare. Purpose B, because this site is proposed to be developed with substantial open, undeveloped areas, including substantial setbacks from the property lines, it will promote light, air, and open space above and beyond what is actually required by the existing I-1 zone. Purpose G, because granting this variance would accommodate an appropriate industrial development on a piece of property with long-standing industrial zoning in place, while at the same time preserving open space and sensitive wetland features on the property. Purpose I, as the building will have a modern warehouse design with an attractive front facade and also comply with the building height requirement as viewed from the public realm along Weston Road. And then finally, purpose J, because this proposal will conserve sensitive wetlands and other open spaces on the property and set aside and conserve much of that area. As to the negative criteria, the focus for the board is first and foremost, does granting this variance for 3.4 feet on one facade of the building result in substantial detriment to the public good? So what are the impacts to the surrounding area? So the first thing to note again is the front facade will have the appearance of a conforming building, number one. The portion of the building which exceeds 35 feet is located adjacent to an industrial use away from the residential. The building itself is set back more than 200 feet from the front property line along Weston Road. The I-1 zone allows the building to be 50 feet from the front property line. So this is a key mitigating factor. To the extent the board has any concerns about the visual impacts of this particular building, the fact that it's set back 200 feet, 4 times what's required from Weston Road, is absolutely an important factor when evaluating the variance request from a planning perspective. So based on the testimony that you've heard during the course of the application, it's my opinion that there's no substantial detriments to the public good as it relates to what is in my view a fairly minimal deviation which is being requested for building height. Likewise, there's no substantial impairment to the zone plan of the community as noted. I think we're meeting the intent of the ordinance, which is to provide a building with that appears to be conforming, at least from the public realm, along Weston Road, and by orienting the portion of the building that exceeds the building height next to an existing industrial use, an industrial zone piece of property. There's nothing in the Hillsborough Township's master plan that speaks to this particular issue, no noted concerns about building height, warehouse height within the I-1 zone or in general. As noted, this is really just a function of how building height is calculated in Hillsborough Township and the need to accommodate an adequate or close to industry standard internal clear ceiling height for the facility, and also to accommodate the depressed area for the loading docks on the easterly facade of the building. So just to summarize on the requested height variance, it's clear from my perspective that the board can grant this variance because it satisfies the positive criteria. There's clearly a number of purposes of the municipal land use law that would be advanced. This deviation is really integral to accommodating a permitted warehouse use on this particular property in a manner that is actually less intense than what's permitted by the existing I-1 zone. And likewise, the board can grant this variance without any substantial detriments to the surrounding area and no substantial impairment to the zone plan of Hillsborough Township. Just finally, there's several design waivers that are being requested, and here I'm relying for the most part on testimony that you've previously heard from civil engineer and other witnesses on this application. I would just note that the standard of review under Section 51B of the Municipal Land Use Law is that the exceptions must be reasonable and within the general purpose and intent of the provisions for site plan review, and that a waiver or exception may be granted only if literal enforcement or one or more provisions of a site plan review ordinance is impracticable or will exact undue hardship because of peculiar conditions pertaining to the land in question. And I think all the requested waivers meet this standard of proof. The first would be for the minimum buffer width that's required between a loading and parking lot containing 10 or more parking spaces and a property boundary, and that requirement is for 30 feet, which is satisfied on almost every portion of this particular project. However, there's one pinch point adjacent to the industrial use to the east where this buffer is at a width of 16 feet. It's at one limited location. Again, this is across from an industrial use, and the mitigating factor is that there is landscaping being provided in this particular area to mitigate any potential impacts on the adjacent industrial user. I would also note that the unusual shape of the property, particularly on this easterly property line, provides the basis for requesting this relief, and that it's impracticable to fully conform with the 30-foot buffer along this particular property line. So a waiver or an exception, in my opinion, is very reasonable in this particular situation. The next two here, I'm just, for the most part, relying upon testimony you've heard from the engineer, but relating to the dimensions of the proposed parking spaces, whereas 10 feet in width and 20 feet in length is required, a length of 18 feet is proposed, which again is industry standard and actually required consistent with the RSIS statewide standards. So perfectly appropriate in this situation for vehicular parking spaces. And then likewise, the width of a two-way drive aisle required being 30 feet, whereas 24 feet is proposed. As you heard, two-way drive aisle width of 24 feet is also standard and compliant with RSIS and adequate to accommodate safe turning movements on this site. So another reasonable waiver request within the context of this application. And then finally, whereas a maximum of one wall sign is permitted, there's two wall signs proposed, including an identification sign. So the applicant is proposing a wall sign for the business and also an address identification sign, whereas only one sign is permitted. Identification signs are address numbers placed on buildings and are used by emergency responders to quickly and clearly identify a property to which they have been dispatched. Zoning ordinances of many other municipalities provide exceptions from sign requirements for these functional identification signs. However, the Land Use and Development Ordinance of Hillsborough does not provide an exception, so here we're requesting a waiver because the address identification numbers technically count as a second sign. But it's certainly reasonable to expect that the building would include one business sign as well as one identification sign, particularly for emergency response purposes. So the strict application of the ordinance requirements would be unreasonable, undesirable, and a hardship upon the applicant given these circumstances. And I think with that, Mr. Ogrodnik. Unless you have anything further for me, that would conclude my direct testimony.
Mr. Hughes. Did you have an up?
Here you go.
Did you happen to have an opportunity to review prior approvals on the subject property?
Yes, I did.
And what are the approvals that are permitted currently on the property?
I did note roughly 20 years ago, there was a prior approval for an industrial park on this property, so a subdivision which would have facilitated a multi-building industrial park. And actually that was well known back 20 years ago, and even when the Hearthstone project was being developed across the street, I've even seen that referenced in the public offering statement for that particular community. So that is a prior approval, again, consistent with the long-standing industrial zoning and planning treatment of this property.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
I'm going to reserve my comments to the end. I have a few. We'll see if they get covered.
Yeah. Dave, go ahead, because I know you.
Sorry, I disappeared. Hi, Mr. Hughes. Am I working? Here we go. Hi, Mr. Hughes.
Good evening.
Good evening. You had represented that the height of the building from Weston Road. I'm a little concerned about what you're representing, and the reason why, looking at the grading plan and also brought up in the Pannoni report, in terms of the height, I believe you represented that the building is going to look as if, how many feet, you said?
Roughly 34 feet.
Okay, so I'm a little concerned about that, because when looking at the grading plan, were you able to take a look at the grading plan to see where the height of the building will be coming up from?
Yes.
Okay, do you recall approximately what that is?
Yeah, the 34 feet is obviously being measured from the finished grade of the building along the frontage.
Right. The reason why I'm asking, because you made a comment, and please feel free to correct. You said that the building was going to look as if it's 34 feet from Weston Road.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm just trying to verify that that's what you meant, because when I look at the grading of the property, or when I look at the grading from Weston Road and where it's approximately 60 feet, and then I look at the grading right at where the building is, it's 78 feet. I'm just trying to understand if that's what you meant.
What I meant was, again, that the building height is being measured from finished grade along that elevation, which will be 34 feet from finished grade. I understand that there's grading that will alter the frontage of the property. My point is the building height will be 34 feet.
So you're talking about the part of the building when you're looking from Weston Road and you're looking up, you're saying that the portion of the building is going to look as if it's 34 feet measured from that grade that's all the way back from 200 feet is what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay. Because the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the way I heard you was, basically providing testimony that the building is only going to look 34 feet from Weston Road, and I was just concerned that the board might not be aware that there's a significant grade change from where the road is all the way to where the building is.
Right.
Okay.
And the building will be 34 feet from grade.
Okay. Additionally, you had made some comments regarding our master plan, and while you had said that you believe that there isn't a specific section that deals with this property, I would like to bring to your attention, and as stated in our master plan reexamination that was last done in 2018, there's two areas in our community design under the goals and objectives, and I wanted to read them to you. Number 3, encourage the development of employment areas near residential developments with design that assures the peace and solitude of residents. In your professional opinion as a planner, do you believe that this design, best meets that objective of the master plan?
Yes, absolutely.
Number 9, require all non-residential development, e.g. industrial, office, commercial, to be compatible with nearby residential neighborhoods. do you believe that this design, this current layout, is the best design in the interest of the public?
I do.
Okay. You had also made a comment that you believe the detriment outweighs the public good, but you didn't seem to discuss much of the detriments. Were you going to testify as to the specific details or the things that the board should be concerned about that could be perceived as detriments?
Well, to be clear, the focus for the board's review, we're requesting one variance here, and that's for building height. And what I indicated in the context of the negative criteria was that when addressing a deviation for building height, and particularly in this particular application, the main concern is what is the visual impact on the surrounding area. The building itself is significantly separated from any adjacent buildings such that there's no concern about shadow impacts. So you're really just talking about visual impacts, and that was the testimony that I provided to the board.
Do you believe the increase of the building might increase the amount of volume or operation of the site?
No.
Okay. I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could continue that line of discussion about the height of the building as viewed from the roadway. Mr. Hughes, is there a retaining wall proposed along the frontage of the building?
Yes.
Approximately how high is that retaining wall?
I don't know the specifics.
Well,
I don't have a specific height referenced on this particular plan.
Okay. If I told you the grade on the driveway in front of the retaining wall was approximately 68, would that seem reasonable to you in your recollection?
Yes.
And if I understand, I believe the finished floor of the building is 78?
Correct.
So there would be would you agree there's approximately a 10-foot difference between that on-site drive and the finished floor?
Correct.
Do you know how far the retaining wall is from the proposed foundation?
No.
If I was to tell you that it's less than 10 feet, would that seem reasonable?
Seems reasonable.
If the retaining wall was, let's say, a foot or so from the building, would you begin to view that wall as part of the building elevation?
No.
At what point would you view an exterior wall as a visual part of the elevation of the building?
As a visual part of the elevation of the building?
Correct.
Well, I'm focused on what's the building height as calculated under the Township of Hillsborough's ordinance, which is 34 feet along that particular frontage. So unless it's physically connected and part of that building, it's not part of the height of the building.
So even if that wall was 20 feet, in your mind, the building still looks like it's 34 feet?
Well, the building height is measured from the finished grade. If there was some provision of the ordinance that we're not aware of that somehow forces you to factor in the height of a retaining wall or doesn't allow you to take into account a change in grade as a result of regrading the property, we would have taken that into consideration. But my point is, the height of this building is 34 feet along the Weston Road frontage.
Well, I wanted to clarify your opinion of the view from Weston Road. And so would not retaining walls between Weston Road and the building impact that visual view?
It might, but the point is the building height's permitted along that frontage. The building is significantly separated, 4 times greater than what's required by ordinance. And in between the road and the building itself, there's a basin, there's landscaping, there's circulation areas, such that there's pretty substantial separation between what's viewed from the public realm and the building itself, which again is 34 feet less than what's permitted under the building height requirements of the ordinance.
Well, I'll just ask one last question. If someone was on Weston Road, and would it be possible for, in their mind, to see this as a 44 or 48-foot tall building because visually they see the building on top of a wall? Is that possible?
Anything is possible. What I'm telling you is that the way building height is calculated from a zoning perspective is this is a conforming building height as viewed from Weston Road. And there's nothing in the ordinance that either prohibits or forces an applicant to take into consideration any change in grade, including the retaining wall that you're referencing.
You discussed the required 30-foot buffer and that there's an area where it's down to 16 feet. Could you help the board by pointing out where the buffer is deficient?
Certainly. It is in here, so along the easterly elevation across from the loading docks adjacent to the adjoining residential or industrial use.
Could you just show the public that too, please?
This has been marked previously, Mr. Ogrodnik. Exhibit number 1. Thank you.
So where you pointed at was what? Just so to explain to them what you were pointing at.
This is the, what was referenced was the required buffer of 30 feet between parking and loading areas of greater than 10 spaces and the property line. And this particular pinch point is roughly 16 feet.
Mr. Hughes, could there be site adjustments to either parking, loading, or building that would accommodate the 30-foot buffer?
I don't know. I mean, that's more of a site design question for an engineer. What I can tell you is that for practical reasons, the deviation is so limited in terms of its location, and it's also directly across from a loading dock adjacent to an existing industrial use. I don't see any need, nor would it be appropriate from a planning perspective, to essentially redesign the site to accommodate a full 30-foot buffer, especially because we're proposing enhanced landscaping in that particular location to mitigate the exception that we're requesting.
Another topic that you touched upon was the positioning of the building and the loading areas. If the loading areas were positioned facing the airport and railroad, would that minimize impacts to Western Road and the neighbors across the street in Hearthstone?
It might be more favorable, but there's certainly nothing in the ordinance that requires the loading docks to be oriented in that manner. And I think the design as proposed is perfectly appropriate because it has the narrower width of the building facing Weston Road across from the residential community. And the loading docks are facing an existing industrial zoned and industrial used property.
Well, when you mentioned the loading docks facing an industrial area, but is there any, the sound just doesn't move directly perpendicular to the wall in the loading dock area. Sound would also travel towards Western Road. Are there any architectural elements to this building proposed to help screen the loading dock area from the Hearthstone project?
Well, number one, the fact that the building itself is set back 4 times greater than what's required by the ordinance. The actual loading dock area is even more significantly separated from that residential community. This is a permitted use, so noise impacts is not something that the board actually should be taking into consideration in evaluating this particular proposal. There's nothing in the ordinance that requires the loading docks to be oriented in a particular way. Obviously we have to comply with the applicable state noise requirements once the facility is up and operational.
Just to piggyback some testimony from the last hearing, there was discussion about adding some type of sound barrier where that ramp is, and the applicant would be amenable to adding an additional sound buffering area as depicted where the ramp is to the satisfaction of the board engineer as well.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Bernstein?
I just have one quick question for the moment, Mr. Hughes. Is the date of your planning report February 2023?
It is.
Has there been a subsequent report since February of 2023?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I'll reserve the remainder of my questions to see after everybody else. Thank you.
Okay. Board members?
Mr. Hughes, I just have one from a planning standpoint. A lot of the testimony was given or questions were already asked, but the size of the development being proposed for the property in itself, do you believe that that is appropriate?
I do, and actually, one indicator of that is the permitted coverage on this property is 60%, and what's being proposed is actually 40%. So there's a pretty significant portion of this property that's going to be set aside, conserved as open space, including some sensitive environmental features. So in my view, it's a permitted use, and the overall size of this development is perfectly appropriate for the site.
That's all I have for now.
Okay.
I have one thing. I'm not sure if you could answer this or not, but did you ever check on the regulations in reference to building height from the airport?
Yeah, Mr. Ford did address that after some comments from the board professionals, and we did make application to FAA. They're reviewing it. We meet all the standards. They may require a red light in one of the corners, but that application has been submitted. Copies were submitted to the board, and we will certainly share any results from FAA.
Can we get the answer to the question asked, Mr. Grodnick, above and beyond what you've done regarding the airport hazard? Can Mr. Hughes answer the question Mr. Scobo asked?
I have not done any investigations of building height as it relates to airport hazard regulations.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Hughes.
Good evening.
Can you describe, from your perspective, what an industrial park is as opposed to the current development?
When I'm referring to an industrial park, it's typically a property that's subdivided to accommodate more than one individual industrial user. So typically there might be an access road and multiple industrial, what I would define as like pad sites for individual commercial and industrial property users, multiple buildings.
Okay. All right, thank you. One other question. On page 13 of your report, you make a comment that truck traffic may increase in line with business growth. Can you elaborate on that? So from the current condition, what would happen if the applicant's business grows as much as he says it's going to?
I think that's consistent with the operational testimony that you heard, as well as the testimony you heard from the traffic engineer, which is, more use, more intensity on the property yields more truck traffic, more trip generation, and all of that, I believe, was taken into account in the traffic study that was presented to the board.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this seems to happen every time I start. It's like 8:30. Do you want me to start, or do you want to do your normal break?
You want a break? Or do you want to go?
I'm happy to keep going.
Okay. We'll keep going.
Okay, great. Mr. Hughes, good evening. My name is Mike Sinkovich. I'm one of the attorneys for the Hearthstone community that you've referenced. And I have a few questions, some a little more general, but all relating to planning. You've, of course, reviewed the land development ordinance in Hillsborough as it applies to this property, correct?
Yes.
And is it correct that the term warehouse or warehousing is undefined in the ordinance?
I don't recall seeing a specific definition.
Okay. Just a general or a minor question I had initially. On page 6 of your report, you state that quote, "The proposed industrial warehouse and accessory office uses are permitted in the I-1 zone." Minor question, how do you come to the conclusion that this is an industrial warehouse or it's an industrial use?
Well, the I-1 zone permits warehousing, shipping, and receiving completely within an enclosed building. I think the operational testimony that the board heard is completely consistent with that category, which is permitted within the zone.
Do you know when the subject ordinance was adopted?
No.
Would you be surprised if I reflected that it was early 80s, 1982?
No, I wouldn't be surprised.
Do you know how, or did you factor in how the nature of warehouse development has changed over the last 40 years in your analysis?
Yes.
In what way did you factor that in?
Well, I think what's notable is to the extent warehouse development, warehouse use, the warehouse industry has evolved. Township of Hillsborough has been very active in its planning efforts. It's, as I noted, reviewed the master plan over and over again during the course of that time. And so to the extent warehouse industry has evolved, that's been accounted for in Hillsborough's planning and zoning policies. So the fact that the zoning has not changed, that warehouse has remained permitted on this particular property and in this zone for decades indicates to me that even as warehouses evolve, the current state of warehouse is still a type of use that is deemed appropriate and permitted on this property.
Is there any indication, and maybe you answered this already, in those reexaminations or other reviews of the ordinance that, you know, up until recently, that the town committee or the planning board looked at warehousing at all?
There was certainly efforts in terms of economic development strategies that were focused on various industrial districts within the town. I don't recall seeing any extensive discussion on the changing warehouse industry.
Are you aware of the State Planning Commission Office of Planning Advocacy's guidance document that was issued to municipalities in 2022?
Yes.
Did you consider that guidance in your report or your analysis?
No.
Just back to the ordinance for a moment. Let me know if this is, I assume you reviewed the purpose of the I-1 zone in your analysis, correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to read it, and hopefully I get this correct. The purpose of the I-1 and I-2 light industrial districts is to create zoning districts recognizing the existing pattern of small industrial-oriented facilities, allowing the remaining vacant lots in the same areas to be developed with similar uses, and providing areas for modest industrial operations. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
What elements of this proposed development, quote, recognize the existing pattern of small industrial-oriented facilities?
Well, that's not the standard of review. The standard of review is, does it meet the requirements of the zoning ordinance? And it's one thing to have an intent statement such as that, but then the important part is that you actually provide requirements that implement that particular policy statement, which I think the township has done in the I-1 zone. So we're fully conforming with all the relevant requirements that the township council would have implemented to satisfy this particular vision. So for example, when I noted that impervious lot coverage is permitted at 60% and this proposal is 40%, to me it's less than what's actually significantly less than what's allowed, and what was allowed was intended to basically implement that intent statement that you just read.
I appreciate that answer. Maybe I'll ask it a different way. Are there any other facilities similar to the one proposed in the I-1 zone near the subject property?
I haven't done an exhaustive analysis of the I-1 zone and other warehouse uses because the use is permitted. That was not relevant to my evaluation of the application.
Would you describe the proposal as a, quote, modest industrial operation?
I would, in the context of warehouse projects that I've worked on over the past 10 years, dozens and dozens across the state. This is on the smaller side, the more modest side of warehouse distribution facilities.
How about as compared to any other warehousing in the I-1 zone or I-2 zone in Hillsborough?
I already answered that question.
Do you know, do any of the industrial lots in the I-1 zone have active rail sidings?
As noted, I did not do an extensive analysis of the I-1 zone because this is a permitted use.
I know you touched on it briefly, but I just wanted to go over it again. Can you, to the extent you know, and I believe you discussed it in your report, can you explain to me what the, more specifically, what the approval that exists for this property is?
Again, I'm aware that there was a prior approval for what I would consider an industrial park, multi-building, subdivision of the property to accommodate multiple industrial uses.
And would this refresh your recollection, to the extent you know, that it was the expectation was a 9-lot industrial subdivision with a separate lot for stormwater management on the approximately 18 acres?
That sounds familiar.
Okay. And the principal buildings would have a floor area from 19,000 square feet to about 26,000 square feet. Does that sound about right?
It sounds right.
Okay. Wouldn't you agree with me that that sounds more like modest industrial operations as opposed to the 130,000 square foot warehouse?
Well, it's a 9-building industrial park that would have been compliant with the I-1 zone. I don't know, I haven't done a side-by-side comparison because all these uses are permitted, so it's not really a relevant consideration for the board.
I believe the question was asked maybe by the township planner in one of his review memos, but did you review the definition of truck terminal in the land development ordinance?
Yes.
I'll read it, and I'd like you to, well, we'll break it down, but just the definition of truck terminal, correct me if I'm wrong, is an originating or terminating point for trucks, which may include servicing facilities for trucks and comfort facilities. The existence or proposed location of storage or warehousing of items transported by trucks shall not be deemed to change the character of a use which meets the foregoing definition of truck terminal. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
Could you explain, I guess, I'll just throw it out there, how this is not a truck terminal?
Well, there's a separate category of permitted use, which is warehousing in the zone, which this is, obviously. A truck terminal is referring, in my view, as I read this definition, more to something like a pilot truck stop or a place where trucks are getting serviced and truckers have accommodations to stay overnight. It's clearly not your typical e-commerce warehouse distribution facility, which is what's being proposed in this application.
Would you agree with me that this facility is an originating or terminating point for trucks?
No, I think trucks, to the extent they're picking up products at the port, they're bringing them here, they're dropping off, they're going to some other destination. I'm not sure it's technically an originating or terminating point, as I understand the operational testimony.
And I guess, similar to that question, how do you account for the part of this definition that states the existence or proposed location of storage or warehousing of items transported by truck shall not be deemed to change the character of the use?
I think what it's saying is that it may include facilities for trucks and comfort facilities, so it's clearly anticipating what I was describing earlier, sort of your typical truck stop or truck servicing facility, and if there's some storage or warehousing component associated with that, it's still a truck stop.
The proposed site plan provides more parking that's required by the ordinance. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes.
And that would be, for example, I think there's 99 passenger vehicle parking spaces where 43 are required, and that would represent approximately 2.3 times the required spaces. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I don't have those specific numbers in front of me, but yes, there's more parking than what's required.
And similarly for loading spaces or loading docks, I mean, 5 are required and 20 are proposed, representing 4 times the amount. Does that sound about right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you explain, because I've asked this question to other people before, why this site is so overparked, for lack of a better term, based on the intended use of the end user?
Well, so first of all, again, we're well below the permitted impervious coverage. But as it relates to parking for warehouse uses, certainly what I've found in my practice is that modern e-commerce warehouse distribution facilities tend to require more truck parking, trailer parking than the same type of use maybe 20, 30 years ago. So parking requirements aren't generally up to speed, what's typically demanded for e-commerce facilities. And to the extent spaces, as you heard from the operational testimony, to the extent spaces are needed for any staging of trailers, it is, when appropriate, best to have that on site. And here we have a site where we can accommodate that rather than adding additional trips to the road to have trailers staging off-site some other property and then returning to the site to pick up the goods for transfer.
So maybe because of the changing nature of warehousing over the last few decades, the requirements for parking aren't up to speed? Is that about what he said, I think?
I would say that the parking that's demanded by this particular user, this e-commerce facility, exceeds what is the minimum requirement for parking in the zoning ordinance.
Shifting gears a little bit, does the current design of this building allow for the use to be easily converted into another type of warehouse? Maybe a fulfillment center or a last mile fulfillment center?
Objection for the record. The question is speculative. You can answer.
Yeah, I would have to defer to the operational testimony that you heard. Obviously,
can you answer it from a planning standpoint, Mr. Hughes?
Well, it's really an architectural question. To the extent it's converted to a use that's not permitted by zone, it would have to seek a use variance from the Zoning Board of Adjustment.
So you're not sure if it could be converted? Are you deferring to the operations person?
What I said was I would defer to operational testimony, and I'd also say it's really more of an architect design question as to the feasibility of that type of conversion.
Okay. You would agree with me that land use approvals run with the land, not the particular approval, correct?
Correct.
In that regard, I note that I think pages 3 and 10 of your report describe this project as a single-tenant warehouse. Do you recall that?
No, but I'll take your word for it.
Is there any guarantee if this project's approved that it will remain a single-tenant warehouse?
Well, it will remain a permitted use. We're proposing a warehousing use that's permitted within the zone. The board doesn't have any ability to impose conditions on that particular use if it's permitted. I'll defer to legal counsel, but from my perspective, I see no reason why multiple tenants couldn't be accommodated within this facility as long as it's permitted by the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
Were the conditions established, et cetera, correct?
I'll defer to legal counsel.
In fact, that whole testimony basically defers to legal counsel. That's not within your expertise, is it, Mr. Hughes?
I'll defer to legal counsel.
Thank you. By the way, to answer Mr. Sinkovich's comment, you might want to take a look at the last sentence on page 10 of your report. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Does that change your testimony as to your comments on that sentence?
Not at all.
Thank you.
In your planning expertise for this I-1 zone, would there be any scenario where a warehouse would not be a permitted use?
Warehousing is permitted.
Okay. So there would be no scenario where there would be that it wouldn't be permitted?
If it's not a warehouse, it's not permitted. If it's a warehouse, it's permitted.
Okay. I wanted to go specifically to the C2 variance for the height that you discussed at length earlier. And I think I think it's on page 9 of your report, but you testified to it as well, the positive and negative criteria. And with regard to the positive criteria, well, let me start with the negative criteria. Actually, we'll go in reverse order. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your focus on the negative criteria was focusing specifically on that 3+ foot difference in height that you're requesting a variance for. Is that correct?
Correct.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I also heard when you were discussing the positive criteria, you were talking about the project as a whole and not the positive benefits of that extra 3 feet. Is that correct?
Correct.
And why is that, just out of curiosity?
That's pursuant to case law as I understand it. I'm satisfying the criteria for a C2 variance. Perfectly appropriate.
I'd like to go through I'm not going to do every one, just a few of the points you said that promotes the purposes of the MLUL. With regard to A, which says, you know, the purpose is to encourage municipal action to guide the appropriate use or development of all lands in the state in a manner which will promote the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Your response in your report, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the provision of a modern warehouse development on an industrial zone land, which includes substantial stormwater management and infiltration improvements, as well as protection and compensation of wetlands areas, promote the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. I want to focus on stormwater management and filtration improvements. How are they improvements when the land's vacant now?
There's no existing stormwater management on the property. I think the testimony is that from the engineer was that there'd be improvements to the overall stormwater management on the site.
As opposed, sorry.
No, my objection for the record. No, my objection for the record. The question is really asking testimony by a non-expert in the area of stormwater management. You can answer if you can.
Mr. Grodnick, I would advise the board I would disagree. Your witness raised the issue in his own report, so to the extent that he can explain what his own report means, I think it's very well within his purview to advise the board accordingly.
And I answered the question.
And I guess the similar question is, how are we encouraging or promoting the purpose of the MLUL by protecting wetlands areas when they're already currently protected because the land's undeveloped?
But it's the proposed development of the site pursuant to the zoning. It's not, the comparison is not a vacant site versus what we're proposing. It's what we're proposing versus, I guess, a building that's fully compliant in building height.
Subsection H is to encourage a location and design of transportation routes which will promote the free flow of traffic while discouraging location of such facilities and routes which will result in congestion or blight. And then you cite the provision of a new access driveway and easement to adjacent Lot 5 will provide needed circulation to this landlocked site. I guess my first question, is there already access to Lot 5 at this point?
Yeah, I did not testify to Purpose H tonight. I see it's in my report. I'll just say that my testimony supersedes that discussion, so we could just probably skip over that.
Okay. Do you know, by the way, if there is, just out of curiosity, do you know if there's already access to Lot 5?
I don't know the particulars. I know all of the access easements have been worked out. I don't know the particular details.
J, this is the last one I'll hit, is to promote the conservation of historic sites and districts, open space, energy resources, and valuable natural resources in the state, and to prevent urban sprawl and degradation of the environment through improper use of the land. And you say the proposal will conserve vulnerable wetland areas through provision of contribution areas and water filtration improvements. it's the same, well, I have the same question, is it your position that because you're developing the site and putting stormwater management facilities on here, that is better than what's already there now, which is a vacant piece of property that is pervious in nature?
No, my testimony this evening was that the proposal will conserve sensitive wetland areas and also set aside significant areas of the property for open space. Again, which is consistent with the fact that we're covering 40% of the site, whereas 60% is permitted, and asking for a minor deviation in building height, with the idea that it's better to go slightly taller than to expand the building footprint potentially, which would maybe reduce open space on the property.
Part of the subsection J also talks about, valuable natural resources of the state. And I guess one of my other questions, and maybe you answered this already, is it's true that the trees are going to be removed from the site as part of this development if it's approved, correct?
Yes.
Do you know how many trees are being removed?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
If you can't approximate, that's okay, but can you approximate?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to touch on one of the waivers. You mentioned that you're requesting a waiver for parking space size, where I believe it's 10 foot by 20 feet are required, and a length of 18 feet is proposed. Is that correct?
Correct.
And my question is, with the fact that the site's already overparked to begin with, and the fact that this property is a vacant piece of land, why can't it be designed to conform with this requirement?
Because the site has been designed to comply with the residential site improvement standards.
Is there a reason why it couldn't be designed to comply with the 10 foot by 20 foot requirement?
You'd have to ask the engineer that question.
Okay, so from a planning perspective, though, you're not sure?
From a planning perspective, I think that would be inappropriate.
Okay. Did you go through, as part of your analysis, any sort of safety analysis with regard to traffic or impacts to Weston Road from this proposed project?
I'm sorry, did I do a traffic study? Or
No, like a safety analysis.
No.
Okay. And you already discussed that the proposed warehouse is within proximity, close proximity to environmentally sensitive land uses like wetlands, correct?
Yes, and all of the necessary permitting from DEP will have to be secured to facilitate the project.
I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
So I think that would be a good time to take about 10-minute recess. I know that clock up there is a little bit fast. I've actually got, according to my Verizon, 8:52, so, what? You sure? Looks like a few. Yeah. So we'll reconvene about 5 after 9 according to that clock. Okay, we're back in session. And I think just completed cross-examination. So, motion to open to public, please.
I'll make a motion.
Excellent. Second. Okay, all in favor?
Thank you.
Aye. Okay, if there's anyone from the public that would like to ask questions of the planner of his testimony, as before, please come up to the mic, state your name and address for the record, please. Oh, yeah, and also, yeah, we got to share some mics here, so.
Thank you. This is the best one. Wow. Thanks. Brian Tarantino, Fairfield Lane, Mr. Hughes. So you said that with regard to the building height, you said that by allowing the variance, it will make the building more efficient. It will be a more efficient warehouse. Is that correct?
Yeah, the testimony is that the building height that's requested provides a clear ceiling height internal to the building, which is closer to 27 to 30 feet, which is still less than the industry standard, but it's closer than if we had a conforming building height.
Right. My specific question was, did you, I believe your testimony, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe your testimony was that the warehouse would be more efficient with the higher the higher ceiling height?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say it's more efficient, does that mean that the warehouse would be able to process more materials? Would be able to store more? They would be able to have a higher throughput of materials because it's more efficient?
It's more efficient in terms of efficiency per square foot. That was the testimony from our operational witness.
Right. But when you say it's more efficient, that translates to more throughput and more volume in the building. Isn't that correct?
More room for product storage.
More room for product storage, and so therefore more volume of materials. Isn't that correct?
Objection to the form, it's speculative, it's not the testimony.
How is
Actually, it's right out of his report.
Yeah, how is it speculative? He said it's efficient, more efficient. I'm exploring this word efficient. It's no speculation at all. When you said efficient, what did you mean?
It could be more efficient in terms of increased throughput, picking and packing, in and out activity.
Okay. And that, did you assess the impact on the on neighbors, on the residential community nearby with that, for that increased throughput and increased activity associated with the higher building height?
No, because the alternative, as you heard from some of the prior witnesses, would be to accommodate additional square footage at a conforming building height.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that presumably at a conforming building height, if the footprint got bigger, if there was more coverage on site to achieve the same amount of product storage, again, we're talking about hypotheticals here, but conceivably you get the same throughput, I suppose. Again, I'm deferring to the operational testimony that you heard earlier in the application.
So is that speculative, you're saying? That?
Well, it's hypothetical, right? Because
okay. So did the applicant and the team that you're a part of explore a larger building to accommodate the square, the total volume that the applicant might need?
I personally did not. I was not part of that exercise.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'm wondering, my question is, with the higher building height and the resultant more efficient building with higher throughput and higher activity, help me understand how that is beneficial to the community. You said one of the reasons why this variance should be approved is because it's beneficial. It has a beneficial impact. Help me understand how that is beneficial to the community and especially the residential community nearby.
I think my testimony was that the proposed building is a better alternative than trying to accommodate that square footage in an expanded building footprint at a conforming building height.
Right. A design which was never presented to the board, isn't that correct?
Correct.
Okay. With regard to the 30-foot buffer for the parking lot, you testified that there were really no other reasonable alternatives. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if that's the exact language that I used.
What was the exact language that you used?
I don't recall.
Okay. In order to be granted the waiver, I believe that there was some standard that had to be met. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And that standard is?
What's your question?
The standard that has to be met in order to justify that waiver is that there aren't any reasonable alternatives. Isn't that correct?
No.
Oh, okay. Do you know what it is?
I do.
Would you mind sharing it?
Such exceptions must be reasonable and within the general purpose and intent of the provisions for site plan review. In addition, a waiver or exception may be granted only if literal enforcement of one or more provisions of a site plan review ordinance is impracticable or will exact undue hardship because of peculiar conditions pertaining to the land in question.
Right. So the 30-foot buffer did you provide a demonstration that there was no other alternative, that it was going to provide an undue hardship on the applicant?
I provided testimony that addresses that standard of review.
And you determined that it would be unreasonable and provide undue hardship on the applicant, is that correct?
Yes.
And in what way would it provide undue hardship?
Again, it's a very limited location where the property line, because of the irregular shape of the property, which causes a peculiar condition that's specific to this particular property, adjacent to one specific area of the parking lot, is a setback of 16 feet, whereas 30 feet is required. And to mitigate that, and again, that location is immediately adjacent to a storage and parking area on an adjacent industrial use. To mitigate any potential impacts of 16 feet as opposed to 30 feet, some plantings are being provided there to increase the visual screen to that adjacent property.
So did you consider reducing the size of the parking lot, which is already oversized?
I personally did not.
Okay. So would you see that as a planner, would you see that as a possible alternative to the waiver for the 30-foot buffer?
Well, anything is possible, but the exception here that we're requesting is reasonable because strict compliance due to the irregular shape of the property is impracticable and will result in undue hardship. It's simply inappropriate and impracticable to completely redesign the entire site for one specific area of the required buffer, which is adjacent to an industrial use and for which we're providing adequate mitigation.
Right. So you're saying you'd have to redesign the whole site? You couldn't just reduce, so as a planner, you wouldn't be able to just reduce, I mean, your professional opinion, you wouldn't be able to just reduce the parking lot size?
Again, I'm not a designer. We have not redesigned the site to accommodate a full 30-foot buffer, but what I'm saying is that what's being requested here clearly meets the criteria for an exception under Section 51B of the Municipal Land Use Law.
Yeah, I guess I'm questioning that because it seems like there's an alternative, and you said it's an unreasonable or it would provide undue hardship. I'm just trying to understand. Your report said that. So, in your opinion, couldn't you just reduce the parking lot size?
I've already answered this question.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Lane Welsh, Orchard Drive. Continuing, Mr. Hughes, on the 30-foot waiver. So 16 feet is almost a 47% decrease from the requirement. So let's round it up and say 50%. That's a lot of a difference, in my opinion. And there's no other way, in your opinion, that would be unreasonable to change that?
Yeah, I think I've answered this question and I've repeated my testimony, which is an opinion as to how this complies with the standard for an exception from the site design standards.
And you agree, though, that the 16 feet from 30 feet is a 47% change, is that correct?
That sounds about right.
Thank you. My name is Nancy Mattei. I live at 6 Cornell Trail. And my question is to you. But before I do that, in the spirit of transparency, I have to tell you that I am a commercial realtor, and I also was previously an industrial manufacturing manager at the Procter & Gamble Industrial Manufacturing Plant in Port Ivory in New York. And so I have some questions that are very specific. In your planning capacity, are you required or do you require of yourself to drive the immediate area of the installation that you are studying?
Yes, as I indicated, I've visited the subject property in the surrounding area.
Okay. And so have you driven from Route 206 to Main Street in Manville, which would be the primary routes of trucks in this area?
I don't know that I've done that specific drive. It's possible, I just don't recall.
Okay. And so what governs, to a great extent, all aspects of real estate, residential, office, retail, and industrial, is what is customary and usual. And as people do not routinely read zoning ordinances, was it notable to you in your travels that this building was not what was customary and usual to this area?
No, this is a permitted use in the I-1 zone.
Okay, so it didn't strike you that most of the industrial locations were very small, single users, with mostly van and little to no tractor-trailer use?
Again, because this is a permitted use in the I-1 zone, I did not do an extensive survey of Hillsborough Township's industrial properties, industrial market. It's simply not necessary for the evaluation that I was asked to prepare in support of this application.
Okay, because in the immediate area, this is not a customary and usual use. And so, as people do not routinely read zoning ordinances, anyone coming into the area would expect the area to be populated by uses that are customary and usual. Would you not agree with that?
No.
Okay. Also, as part of your travels regarding the location, have you at all considered the ingress and egress of tractor trailers to the facility, to and from the facility?
We've submitted a traffic analysis. There was extensive testimony provided by a traffic engineer. But because this is a permitted use, the off-site traffic generation of the facility is not really pertinent to site plan review.
Okay. Did you note that the main access road from Route 206 to Main Street in Manville was a single-lane, very narrow, tortuous, unwinding road?
I think I've answered the question.
Okay. So let's talk about the site itself. Have you, as planner, studied the flow of traffic within the site?
No.
Okay. Do you have any knowledge of how many trucks the user is planning to use on a daily basis within a 24-hour period?
As I indicated, I'm not the traffic engineer. There was prior traffic testimony provided.
Okay. Are you aware that a facility of this size with this many bay doors can pump out 480 trucks a day, coming in and going out?
Again, I'm not going to testify to any traffic-related aspects of the proposal because we've already provided that testimony.
This is not related to traffic. This is related to internal to the site and the capacity of the site. And you, as planner, would address capacity, I would think.
Note or objection as to the form of the question.
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
I'm objecting to the form of the question.
Okay, should I rephrase it for you?
Well, you're asking about traffic.
Okay.
So, yeah, if you have a question about planning, we'd be happy to answer any question.
Okay, so my question regarding planning was, were you planning for a tremendous amount of traffic coming into and exiting the site?
to the extent that it is possible to do 480 trucks a day?
Again, we're going to object. There is absolutely no factual basis to represent a trip generation that high. There's been no expert testimony related to traffic that would project that number, and this is our planner, not our traffic engineer. So.
Okay. Are you aware of the amount of time it takes to either load or unload a truck?
Again, that was not part of my testimony this evening.
Okay, it takes a half an hour. And so that gives you, on a 3-shift basis, 24 tractor trailers per door. And there's your 480. That is tremendous traffic in this area. And it is tremendous.
Ma'am, you can't provide testimony. Can you just please ask questions on the testimony that this man has given?
I will form that in as a question.
Okay.
Thank you. So, given that we have a capacity of 480, and I have unloaded trucks in less than a half an hour with both fork truck, clamp truck, and pull pack. So I know how long it takes to load and unload trucks. Is there anything in your planning that addresses that volume?
Ma'am, this is a permitted use. I'm happy to address any questions you have about the testimony that I provided this evening, but I'm not going to testify to any trip generation or traffic-related aspects of the proposal.
Okay, thank you so much. There you go.
Off the table. Bob Hollingshead, 31 Winding Way. I understand you said that the site is in compliance, but do you know the height of the adjacent industrial building? You said you drove that area a lot.
I do not have a building height measurement of the adjacent industrial building.
Do you believe your building is higher?
It may be. Again, I don't know.
I think
the height
it's
of
a
that
lot
building.
higher. Thank you.
I did forget a couple of questions. Are you aware of the turning capability of a tractor trailer in your planning of the flow around the facility itself?
Again, I want to answer your questions, but you keep asking traffic-related questions that I'm unable to answer in my expert capacity.
Okay, I can accept that. And also, are you aware that even within the facility, as you look at the flow of tractor trailers within the facility that are both loading and unloading, it would be impossible for those tractor trailers to make a right-hand or a left-hand turn onto the main road without the loss of property, because the road would need widening. There would be no way the tractor trailers could make those turns.
Again, I don't have an expert opinion on that. That's inconsistent with the testimony that was previously provided by the traffic engineer.
Okay, so you haven't looked at all at the possibility of the roads having to be significantly widened to accept any of this?
Just note or objection for the record. Again, traffic testimony, not planning testimony.
Okay, thank you so much.
David Brook, 7 Winding Way. Just a few quick ones. There was so much discussion about height of the building. I just wanted to get some clarity if I could. How do you determine the height of the building? That's my question.
Well, the height is based on the definition of building height in the Township of Hillsborough zoning ordinance. It's been checked and confirmed, I believe, by the township professionals. It's a calculation that's originally provided by the applicant. The architect, to be specific.
But you talked about the height of the building, 8.4. That's correct, yes?
That's correct.
So can you just clarify for me and for everybody else, and maybe for the board, how did you take that measurement? Was it from the ground? Is it from the floor? And how up above did you measure? Did you measure the wall? Did you measure the roof height? How do we get that number?
That's really an appropriate question for the architect who did the actual calculation.
But you testified that it conforms. Should you be testifying about conformity if it's not in your bailiwick?
Well, I didn't independently do the calculation. It was done by the architect, and it was checked also by the township's professionals. That's my understanding.
Well, we'll forget them for now because they're not testifying. You said the floor height is 78 feet. Is that correct? The bottom of the floor measurement above the world, 78 feet?
The testimony of, I believe it was the architect, was that the finished floor along the frontage of the site facing Weston Road was at an elevation of 78 feet.
So does anybody, or did anybody explain how they got to the 38.4? Let me ask it differently, sorry. Are we measuring that 38.4 from the 78 feet, which is the slab height, I guess? Is that the right term?
Again, I'm going to defer this to the architect who provided the calculations and provided the testimony on the calculation of building height.
Okay. We seem to have spent a lot of time on it, though, with regards to different heights. And I guess I'm not sure what you were actually testifying to then, because you're saying that's the architect, correct?
Well, to be clear, I was testifying in connection with the requested variance that we're seeking. I'm relying upon a calculation that was properly provided by one of the other design professionals on the team. I don't have to independently do that calculation. I can use their calculations, which were checked by the township professionals, to support my testimony for the variance request.
Again, I can't speak for the township, but it didn't sound like they were necessarily agreeing with you. Thank you for that. I just have a question or two about that lovely 30-foot buffer that seems to be raising many questions. When the question came up as it related to that, is there any reason that you can't move the entire footprint of the building and the design 14 feet in a different direction? We're talking about the whole design, just shifting it over.
I mean, that's a hypothetical. It's not the application that's before the board. And I provided the testimony to support why an exception is appropriate given these circumstances, particularly as it relates to the irregular shape of the property and the very limited location in which this deviation exists.
Were you constrained from doing that in the design of the building?
I didn't design the building.
I'm sorry. From your review of it as the person looking at the design and the layout, were you constrained in any way? Specifically, did Lot 7 constrain you from having the ability to move it?
I was not asked to move the building, nor did I design the site.
Are you familiar with Lot 7?
Yes.
Are you aware whether that played any role in the constraints that were put upon you or anybody else?
That's clearly a constraint within the site, but what I can tell you is that doesn't change my opinion as to why a deviation or exception in this case for 16 feet in this very limited location meets the criteria for same in the municipal land use law.
Okay. Did you or anybody from the applicant ever consult the adjacent property owner that you will be so close to as to what they felt about it? And I realize you're not obligated to do that, but I'm just asking whether anybody did.
Personally, I do not.
Are you aware of anybody from the applicant consulting with the next door neighbor?
Personally, I'm not aware.
Okay, and that's fine. Are you familiar with the status of Lot 7 at this point?
I'm going to have to defer to legal counsel on that.
That's a no, I take it.
I don't understand your question, but I think it's getting into legal matters which are beyond my area of expertise.
No, it's not. It may be a legal matter, but it also relates to the design of the building itself and any kind of architectural constraints that would be put upon it if you don't own the property. That's the question.
Sorry, what is the question?
The question is whether the fact that the developer does not or does not own Lot 7 constrain your architectural designs.
I didn't design the project.
Did you play a role in designing the building?
I did not design the building.
Could you just explain what role you did play with regards to this building, since I'm a little bit confused by your answer?
I'm not an architect, I'm not a civil engineer, so I was not a design professional on this particular application.
And just explain what role did you play again, so maybe I'm confused. I'm sorry.
So I was involved with the application team in filing the application, finalizing the plans, modifying the plans, but in general, I evaluated the application from a planning perspective with a particular focus on the relief that we're requesting from the board and whether that relief satisfies the criteria in the municipal land use law.
Right, so as the planner, the question is, did you in some way or another get involved in any constraints that would have existed for planning out this building?
I've answered the question.
I'm sorry, but I don't remember what it was. Could you just repeat your answer? Because I didn't hear it.
No, I think I've answered it maybe 3 different ways, which is that I'm not a design professional, and I explained to you what my role has been in this particular application, and it was not designing the building.
Right, but as a planner, you're here to testify as to the conformity of the building and the variances that you're seeking, and that's the only reason I was asking about the 30 feet in Lot 7, since those seem to constrain what you can do on the property. Do you agree that those constrain what you can do on the property?
I mean, there's any number of constraints on any property.
I just was referring to the 30-foot buffer, that's all, and the 16 feet that you're proposing. I mean, you're here to justify.
David, can we move on from this? This is ad nauseum. You're about the 3rd or 4th person to ask about it, and he has answered it quite a bit. He feels he's justified in asking for that variance. So I'm not sure where you're going with your line of questioning or lack of at this point. So please go to the next question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, can I let somebody else go
Yeah, let
first?
someone else.
You've already been up twice. Can I let someone waiting in line to go next?
Would I be permitted to do this at another time?
There's still other people waiting in line to let them go first.
That's fine.
No.
Come on, Maria. We're running out of time,
We're
so...
running out of time because I'm ready to move. She has spoken twice. This is... No one has time to give.
Okay.
If...
Yes, I promise not to darken your door anymore tonight. Can you please tell me, as part of your planning capacity, did you have anything, did you in fact assess the battery charging situation within the building?
No.
Okay, even as that's a part of the approval process?
No.
Okay. Not cafeteria size, OSHA regulations, that kind of thing?
No.
Okay. All right, that's all. Whoops, careful.
Don't hit the camera.
Maria Janusik, 720 East Freck Avenue, Manville, New Jersey. Did you state that you had visited the site?
Yes.
So when you visited the site, you're saying that the site is good for this particular use. Do you feel that the road that accesses this use is appropriate for the use?
That's not something that I had to evaluate because this is a permitted use on this particular property. And any other traffic-related questions, I'm going to have to defer to the traffic engineering testimony that was previously provided.
Thank you. You've repeated that so many times. But in order for you to say that this is a good location for this use, there's got to be a way to access it. So is this road appropriate to access this use? And I know you're like a broken record saying the same thing over and over, but that doesn't answer the question.
Well, another way to answer the question is that it's a permitted use, and the governing body of Hillsborough Township has determined that a warehousing use is, or at least at the time of the filing of the application, was in a permitted and appropriate use for this particular property.
Okay, so this is what is the zone of this property?
I-1.
I-1 light industrial. Light industrial. Is there a difference between a light industrial zone and a general industrial zone or a heavy industrial zone?
There could be.
There could be. So probably considering the meaning of light, it would not be a humongous warehouse that's the size of 3 football fields. What is the warehouse that is located, is it to the east of this property?
There's a small industrial building located to the east of this property.
Small industrial building, is it a warehouse?
There may be some storage of goods in there. I don't know the details of that particular use.
Okay. When you visited the site, did you see any kind of activity at that warehouse?
There's no warehouse and distribution going on. I mean, most of the activity appears to be internal to the site, internal to the building.
Internal. So that would be consistent with a light industrial zone where most of the activity is inside of the building. In your review of what is permitted in an I-1 light industrial zone, how many docks are permitted with the warehouse, loading docks?
I'm not aware of any requirement in the ordinance relative to the number of loading docks.
Well, when you looked at it, did you see any reference at all to loading docks?
There are references to loading docks
in the I-1 light
ordinance.
industrial zone?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, when you looked at what is permitted in the I-1 light industrial zone, where does it state how many loading docks are permitted?
Yeah, that one I did answer. I'm not aware of any specific requirement as to the number of loading docks.
Did you see any reference to loading docks in the I-1 light industrial zone?
If you're asking whether loading docks are permitted, the answer is
No, I asked you, when you looked at the requirements of the I-1 light industrial zone, did you see any reference to loading docks?
I did not see loading docks expressly permitted as a principal use. That's because they're accessory, customarily incidental, and subordinate to warehousing facilities.
Okay, warehousing
So it's not
facil-
surprising to me if loading docks are not expressly permitted as a principal use, because they're not a principal use.
Okay, but then there is a difference between a light industrial use and a general industrial use, and I don't know if there's a heavy industrial use. So wouldn't reference to loading docks be stated in whatever zone they're permitted in?
Not necessarily.
No. What is the use of the property that is only going to have a 16-foot buffer?
It's an industrial use. I think it's a contractor or some kind of light industrial facility.
In regard to the parking spaces, and I know it's been asked before, but there are more parking spaces than are required. However, there's a request to allow smaller parking spaces, and also the width of the aisles requested is 24 feet instead of 30 feet. Would it appear that there's some kind of ulterior motive to have more parking spaces and to have as much space as possible in the parking lot?
No.
No. What industrial uses have you seen around this property that would suggest that this is also a good use?
Again, I didn't do that evaluation because this use is permitted on this property.
You keep saying this use is permitted on this property. This is a light industrial zone. There's nothing mentioned in the ordinance
Ms.
regarding
Janusik,
loading
question,
docks.
please.
And you repeat the same thing over
Ms.
and over,
Janusik,
like
so
a
do
broken
you-
record, yes.
Questions only.
You mentioned that there had been prior approvals for this property?
Yes.
And what was the prior approval?
There was a prior approval for an industrial park.
An industrial park, and what was, were approvals given for anything in that industrial park?
I don't know the details. I believe there was a subdivision approval for, mentioned earlier, I believe it was 9 lots, maybe 8 industrial lots.
Industrial lots, but was there also approval given for any use on those lots?
I'm not certain.
Okay. Could there have been approval given for warehouses this size on all those lots?
No, obviously, if this property is subdivided into 8 or 9 smaller lots, a warehouse of this size cannot be accommodated on any of those 8 to 9 smaller lots.
So would it make sense then, or thinking about it, that those lots, those uses were a lot smaller than what is being proposed for this lot?
Again, I don't know the nature of the individual uses of those lots. I think the point is there's history on this property of a prior industrial approval consistent with the I-1 zone. This proposed use is also consistent with the I-1 zone.
Okay, so the prior use was consistent with the I-1 zone, and that was subdivided, the property was subdivided into at least 8 or 9 lots. I think I had read somewhere that there were 13 warehouses that were approved, but you don't have that information. So if those lots were smaller, then the term light industrial applied to those lots versus this humongous warehouse that's being brought in, and you insist on saying that this is consistent with the zone. Why is there a request to have the aisles smaller than required, the parking lot, the aisles smaller than required?
The request is simply to bring the site design into compliance with the residential site improvement standards, which is sort of an industry standard for vehicular parking and not just residential projects, but also non-residential, and that's perfectly appropriate for this particular use, as was testified to by the civil engineer as well as the traffic engineer.
So 24-foot aisles are consistent with residential, but not with industrial?
And that's not what I said.
All right, so then why is this necessary here if there's more parking spaces than necessary? This should not be approved if there's no need for those smaller parking spaces. You said that this use is modest in comparison to other places?
Yes.
Okay. Are the other places also zoned light industrial?
I believe the question earlier was, how does this compare to other warehouse facilities that I'm familiar with or have worked on in the state? And my answer was, this is on the modest or smaller size as compared to other warehouse distribution facilities. And of those other facilities, I can't sit here tonight and tell you the specific zoning treatment of each and every one of those properties.
Okay, so those are warehouse distribution facilities, and you don't know if they are zoned light industrial?
I've certainly worked on other warehouse projects that are located in loosely defined light industrial zones, to answer your question.
Yes. Well, that wasn't my question. My question is something of this size in a light industrial zone that you've seen and worked on?
Yes.
Yes. Can you say where?
I'm not going to provide specific examples. I'll tell you that I've worked on dozens and dozens of warehouse projects throughout the state. As I said earlier, they really range in size. I would say this is on the smaller side. Many of those are located in industrial zones.
Industrial zones. Is there a contaminated site adjacent to this property?
Again, I'll defer that to other witnesses. I'm aware that there's a closed landfill adjacent to the property, but it was not part of my evaluation.
So when you say that this is a good location for this use, and there will be people going to work, lots of people apparently, and they might be close to a contaminated site that might impact their health, and you still say that this is a good site, appropriate for this use?
Well, it's permitted use, and thankfully we have very extensive rules and regulations governing contaminated properties in New Jersey.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's lots of rules and regulations, but
Question,
are they
please.
abided by?
Ms. Jane, you said question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a question to find out regarding the property owner that's adjoining that is only going to have a 16-foot buffer. Who can answer that question?
This is planning. Cross-examination of our planner.
What?
What's your question for the planner?
For the planner? Okay, all right, so he doesn't know. All right.
Mr. Ogrodnik, I'm sure the property owner was notified of the application, so if he had any questions, I'm sure he would be here, possibly.
Yeah, and we have not heard any negative or any communication from the adjacent property owner.
So how do we get the identity of the
That's
adjacent
not
property owner?
relevant right now. You can look at a tax map.
And Oprah that? Okay, I think that's all. Thank you.
Mayor Anderko, 325 North Main Street, Manville. Mr. Hughes, based on your experience as a professional planner, You say you have experience in other warehouse sites. Could you, just for my satisfaction and based on your professional experience, rate this site from a 1 to 10, with 10 being the best? How would you personally rate this as a planner?
To answer your question, no, I cannot do that.
Why not?
That was not part of my evaluation.
That's really disappointing.
Okay, see no one else. And looking at the time.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
can I ask a few questions? I know we're getting close to the witching hour.
As long as they're only questions.
They're only questions, and they're hopefully only planning. Mr. Hughes, you've testified several times tonight that you relied on the comments of the proposed consultant operator for this project. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Was that before or after you rendered this report?
After.
So why wasn't the report amended to reflect that information?
Well, maybe I'm deferring to legal counsel here, but my understanding is a report was required to be filed with the filing of the application as a checklist item. And tonight, through my direct testimony, I supplemented or amended that report through my direct testimony based on the testimony of the prior witnesses.
The requirement for the report, Mr. Hughes, was to permit the board, the public, and the professionals to be able to best deal with your proposed testimony rather than dealing exactly what happened tonight, which was testimony without any basis upon which the information could be obtained. So, if you may, correct me if I'm wrong, the only discussion of a substantial detriment for this variance, and we're going to talk about the variance, is the unnumbered paragraph 1 on page 10?
Oh, but I'm referring to my direct testimony this evening.
I'm referring to your report.
Well, I'm relying upon the direct testimony that I provided to the board this evening to the extent it amended, revised, elaborated upon anything that's in my planning report. That's the testimony that I'm submitting to the board for the record.
Board can note accordingly on that item. Let me ask again.
Can you just clarify what you're trying to say, Mr. Bernstein? Because we've had 8 hearings.
The requirement of the planning report, Mr. Ogrodnik, as you are well aware, because this is not the only application you have here, is that to avoid exactly what happened tonight, which was the planner coming up and testifying without anybody having any knowledge as to what he or she was going to testify to, and to provide a report with no less than 10 days before their testimony as to what they were going to provide so that Mr. Coyce, Mr. Mayu, the board, the objectors, the public would be aware of Mr. Hughes' testimony. Mr. Hughes has told us all that this report is ostensibly been supplemented by his direct testimony tonight. So the report that we've been given is contrary to the directive of the board, which went into effect several months ago. I believe nearly 6, if not more than 6 months ago at this point. I'm just making for the record that I asked him why he didn't amend the report. He's relying on his testimony. The board can deal with it accordingly in regard to the rules of the board and everybody else's knowledge. I'm asking a question relative. It's now your direct testimony along with unnumbered paragraph 1 on page 10 of your report as to the substantial detriment aspect of a flexible C2 variance?
Yeah, my testimony this evening on the negative criteria, the first aspect was really focused on what are the impacts to the surrounding area. I explained why in this case, the central issue is what are the visual impacts to the surrounding area of the proposed height deviation. I explained that there's no concern about shadow impacts on surrounding properties. So really the central concern was visual impacts, and I addressed that through my testimony.
And that includes the screening of 5 birch trees and 4 maple trees in front of the building, correct?
That would include any proposed screening that's proposed along the frontage of the property.
Which is, according to your report, 5 birch trees and 4 maples.
Well, let me be very clear. It's based on what is the current plan before the planning board.
The report wasn't based on the current.
Mr. Bernstein, if you're suggesting that a planner can't listen to all of the expert testimony.
No, I'm suggesting, Mr. O'Brien.
No, I'm making a record, Mr.
Fine.
Bernstein. I'm trying to understand what you're suggesting. You're saying that because the planner's report predated amendments, operational testimony, that he can't rely upon them in direct testimony?
No, what I'm saying is he was asked to produce a report. The report was dated February. It's now July. If Mr. Hughes is relying on testimony that's been provided to this board has the right to get an amended report and not what I would call supplemental testimony when everybody else that we've asked for, as you are well aware, has been asked to provide a report that is contemporary with the situation, because you brought up at times the same witness more than once in order to testify about something related to an amendment.
An expert witness can and does regularly rely upon the cumulative testimony of all the witnesses,
And that is,
be it expert testimony or layperson testimony or industry.
We're not disputing what he can rely on, Mr. Ogrodnik. What we're disputing is that Mr. Hughes' report does not cover all the items.
No, that's incorrect. It covers all of the variances and waivers that were identified.
It covers all the items relative to what he put in his report. He has now supplemented the report. I've made the record, you've made the record.
Okay, well, what was the deficiency that in Mr. Hughes' report?
The deficiency is Mr. Hughes is telling us that he is relying upon additional information from the operator, from the traffic engineer. The record will state for what it says. I'm just making the point for the record as well. I have a couple more questions, Mr. Chairman, relative to this variance request. This is a variance request irrespective of whether it's on Weston Road or not. Is that correct, Mr. Hughes?
It's a variance request for the application that's before the board. The specific location of the height deviation happens to be on the elevation, which is adjacent to the industrial property to the east.
It's an overall variance. It's not limited to Weston Road. We've had this testimony relative to the 34 feet on Weston Road. If that didn't need a variance, you would have made one. Is that correct?
I believe I answered your question.
Since the maximum permitted height is 35 feet, correct?
I believe I answered your question.
Okay. You indicate the proposed development meets several purposes of the MLUL. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which ones do they now meet? You've indicated at least H doesn't apply. Are there any others that don't?
A, B, G, I, J.
Thank you. Do you know how high the building is at 113 Weston?
No, someone already asked that question, and I explained that I have not done a building height calculation of that particular building.
I'm asking because you make it a point to indicate that it's similar to the building that's being proposed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And that the next sentence is the building will be compatible with the existing industrial context of the area. What does Mr. Bernard's fiscal analysis have to do with detriment or positive or negative criteria for this variance?
It's simply to show that in terms of the negative criteria, the potential detriments, that there would be no detrimental impacts to the budgetary finances of the municipality.
You're aware that the report is not in evidence and Mr. Bernard has not testified?
I'll defer to legal counsel.
I have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So we're just past 10 o'clock. I know we are past from introducing any new testimony for this evening. I don't think there's anyone else that's going to be questioning. So I think now we need to find a date to carry.
Do we have any other witnesses, Mr. Ogrodnik?
Yes.
On direct?
No further direct questions, no direct witnesses, just Mr. Ford on rebuttal.
And whoever else you may decide to call on rebuttal, et cetera, correct? You're reserving your right to call.
We were reserving our right, but we do not anticipate any other any other witnesses other than Michael Ford.
But you are reserving your right for...
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I believe the next available date, and Mr. Coyce can correct me if I'm wrong, is November.
There you go.
We got to talk, because we got a couple of things to go on here besides picking a new date. We got to extend the time of decision. And also to the objectors, how's November looking for you?
What date is that?
Tough to say.
How about for your witnesses?
Yeah, more importantly, your witnesses.
You want to talk for a moment?
Are there any particular, oh, sorry.
What, David?
I can do it real quick.
Could we just adjourn for a moment, just to talk the schedule?
We
So I can bring to your attention?
We can take, well, you need 5 minutes?
Yeah,
All right.
or less.
You recording?
Mr. Chairman, based upon the discussion amongst the parties and everybody's internal sympathy for Mr. Ogrodnik on other matters, the proposal is for this hearing is to extend it to October the next hearing will be October the 12th. And the TOD, Michael?
Yeah, we'll execute that through the end of October.
And the objectors' witnesses are available?
As of now, yes.
I would suggest that they be.
We're doing our best.
You're anticipating calling 2 experts, is that correct?
Yeah, we anticipate calling 2 experts, and we have, I think, 3 lay witnesses.
Well, minimally, the 2 experts need to be here on the night of the 12th.
Understood.
Unless they are hospitalized or otherwise.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time.
We need a motion, Mr. Chairman, to continue this application without further notice to Thursday, October the 12th, 2023 at 7 p.m. or as soon thereafter as the matter may be heard without further notice.
I make a motion?
Second.
Okay. Roll call, please.
Mr. Wagner? Yes. Mr. Peason?
Yes.
Mr. Scoba?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Committeeman Ciccarelli?
Yes.
Mayor Lapani?
Yes.
Chair Sarachi?
Yes. Okay, so with that, we do have a meeting next week. Actually, we have meetings scheduled for every Thursday of this month, so just want to remind the board members, if you unable to attend, please let the planning office know as soon as possible. So we do have a meeting again next Thursday, July 13th at 7 p.m. All right. He's already escaped.
He went out the side, so we'll
Okay.
see him again next week.
Okay, so with that, I'll
Motion
entertain a
to adjourn.
There you go, Mr. Mayor. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, we're adjourned.
Good night, everybody.
I think he's coming back.